Good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast. Good morning to everyone on Central Mountain and Pacific time. I'm Tom Klein, and welcome to the Gramm Leach Bliley Safeguard Rule Update. Just one housekeeping note. There is a Q&A section on your screen, so I'll do my best to answer your questions. Feel free to ask them as we go. I'm not going to save them till the end. Although there'll be time for you to ask questions in the end. So feel free to ask as we go, and let's get started. Just about 60 seconds about me. I'm a third-generation car guy. I was a dealership owner for 30 years. You may recognize what one of these things is. This is actually an ashtray. You can see this says courtesy and fairness since 1925, which is when my family started in the car business. So my family's been in the car business almost 100 years. So that's where I come from. So we're talking about the Gramm Leach Bliley Act, which as you saw from the title slide, everyone is required to be up to speed and in compliance by December the 9th. When we talk about this, we have to talk about it in the context of overall corporate governance and risk mitigation. And this is what I call the three stools. The three legs of the stool. The first thing you have to worry about is customer and employee dispute resolution, making sure you're handling those problems so that the regulatory agencies and the regulatory bodies aren't coming into your dealership and trying to tell you what to do. The second is compliance. And the third leg of the stool is risk transference. And risk transference is how are we going to, as an organization, make sure that we transfer our risk wherever our risk might be, either to policies that we can install to make sure that those policies capture the problems and solve them before they come big, or insurance policies. What kind of insurance policies do we need in order to make sure that we mitigate our risk? So the Gramm Leach Bliley Act, what is it? The Gramm Leach Bliley Act is a federal data security rule that requires dealers to keep customer information secure. That's all information. That's not just electronic information, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. It also requires the affiliates and service provider partners have to safeguard the data as well. And we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of that and make sure that you have a great understanding by the time we're done today. The Gramm Leach Bliley Act Safeguard Rule history, originally effective May 23rd, 2003. The changes, for the most part, are becoming effective on December the 9th of this year. John Perazim said, will we get a copy of this? The answer to that is yes, John. I'll give you the information at the end, and you can make sure that you have a copy. So why did the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, why do we have this? Well, simply, it's because of the number of data breaches. There have been so many, Uber and Delta and Marriott Hotels, and every time you turn around, you hear about a data breach, and the consumers got upset about this and complained to the FTC. This is one of the main complaints to the FTC, and so this is why they passed the new parts of the data, the safeguard rule, which is what we're going to go into here. And anybody who would like a copy of this, please, I'll give you my email information at the end. Donovan and Nathan, please send me an email and I'll be happy to send you the deck. So the first is willful non-compliance. What will happen if you or your organization are just not going to comply with this law or this rule? Well, willful non-compliance always comes with a high price tag. Usually when a regulator comes into your business, if you are trying to comply, if you can show them the logs, if you can show them the compliance activity, if you can show them what you're trying to do to comply, and not just with the Gramm Leach Bliley Act, but with all the various things that we have to comply with as dealers, they will usually, if they're coming in, you're going to write a check. It'll usually be a smaller check though. But as far as willful non-compliance, that's when you're going to get barbecued. So we're going to make sure for everyone here today that that doesn't happen. So the overall philosophy here is to make sure that you remediate and correct any problems, document and report up through the chain of command, and evaluate and revise. You're going to see this slide at the end of the presentation, but it's important for you to know this is kind of where we're aiming. If there are problems that you find, you have to remediate them, correct them, document them, and report them up the chain of command, and then on an ongoing basis, evaluate and revise your policies and procedures to make sure that you are continually complying with these rules. The first thing that is important to understand about the new regulations is the FTC changed the definition of PII, or personally identifiable information. Now all information has to be encrypted, and that includes the home address. So what's now personally identifiable information is the home address, a cell phone number, an email address. Any and all of that is now considered personally identifiable information, where that was not the case previously with the Gramm-Leach Bliley Act. So your responsibility is, and David Teft asked, is this being recorded so you can watch later? The answer is yes, it is being recorded. You can see it either on MCN's website or on my YouTube channel under Better Vantage Point. So your responsibility is to develop, implement, and maintain a comprehensive information security program, which is also known as ISP, to protect PII, which contains administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. And we're going to break down each one of these as we go. The 4 keys to success in implementing this is make sure that your people understand what's going on, all of your managers, and this applies to your entire organization, not just the salespeople. I get asked that question very often. Is this just a sales issue? And the answer is no, because if you think about it, there's PII all over the dealership. Now, if you're leaving repair orders open, that's PII, because it's got the customer's address, it's got their phone number, it's got their email, it's got their cell phone number. So making sure you have policies in effect and making sure your technology is up to date and as secure as it can be is all part of the Gramm-Leach Bliley. So data encryption, secondary to understanding what the definition of PII is all data now has to be encrypted both at rest and in transit. So let's talk about what that means. So that means that you can no longer send PII or a customer's information through your email, as an example. You can't send information from your website into your CRM or into your DMS. This includes all of your vendors. And we're going to talk about how to make sure all of your vendors are complying, because you are required to get them to commit in writing that they are encrypting all the customer data. And in doing that, you have to consider all the sources of customer information that are coming through. That would include a service scheduler. That pretty much includes everything at the dealership where you have customer information that can be captured in any way. So it has to be encrypted both in transit. So for an example, if you send an email, and at rest, which means if your CRM is just sitting there at 12 o'clock midnight, customer data has to be encrypted. So customer information, where is it? Remember, this is an analog problem just as well as it is an electronic problem. So credit applications, deal folders, websites and apps. I mentioned CRM before, the DMS, all of your vendors, the F&I offices. Physically, who has access to the F&I offices? Are the doors kept locked? I advocate that you put door closers with locks on them so that customers can't just walk in, pick up a folder, and look at personally identifiable information, because there's information laying everywhere, at the sales tower, at the salesman's desk, no information should be left on the salesman's desk. And after December the 9th, no longer can you send PII through email. Customer information in OEM. There's no exemption or exception rather, or special treatment for your OEMs. The information that flows between you and your OEM also has to be encrypted. So you have to have the same data sharing arrangements. That should be in writing. I know that's difficult and they may or may not be ready for this, but the FTC says all of your vendors are supposed to comply with this, or you're supposed to change vendors. Obviously, that's not realistic with the OEMs, but you should document all the conversations you have with the OEMs to make sure that they are encrypting the customer information. Elizabeth Barrera said, you can't send email. You can't even send email if it's encrypted. If it is encrypted, you can send it. It's no problem. You can send PII because it's encrypted. But with the OEMs, if they're not complying, make sure you document that you called them. Make sure you document what the update is, that they said that they're going to be in compliance on this date, and then follow up. Employee cell phones is a big problem. How do they connect with the rest of your infrastructure, your IT infrastructure, and to what do they connect? Do they contain data? If you're a store that does a lot of secondary business, then of course salesmen are collecting STIPs, they're collecting tax returns and pay stubs and all these things. All of these things need to now be encrypted. So employee cell phones are not encrypted. So you need to consider how you're going to handle that on a go-forward basis if your employees are gathering that information either with their camera or with whatever other methodologies they're using. Shred bins. So when you have deals that don't go through, you should be keeping them for a period of time, but are they secure? Do you lock them somewhere? Because all the unfunded deals have copies of these STIPs. They have to be kept secure. Some companies will use shred bins as temporary housing for those deals, and then they'll have somebody come pick them up and take them to a locked warehouse. That's a good way to do it. I certainly advocate that, but you have to figure out what you're going to do with copies of your unfunded deals and all those notices, pay stubs, STIPs that go with it. Passwords. I still walk into dealerships and I see passwords from salesmen. They're written on desk blotters. They're yellow Post-it notes around. That shouldn't happen even before December the 9th. So one thing with passwords that you can consider is using, there's a tool called 1Password, for example. Apple has its own, I believe Google has its own, where it will encrypt all of your passwords for all of your websites that you log into. So you only have to remember 1Password. This is a good way to handle passwords. But keeping them on your desk blotters is not a good idea, and it is a violation of the Gramm Leach Bliley Act. Where to start with your vendors and encrypted data? What I recommend you do is go through your payables list and make a list of all of your vendors that you're passing PII. Remember the service scheduler. Remember any electronic communication in and out of your body shop. Some dealerships have leasing companies. If you've got collection notes, anything that has customer information, and I know lots of dealerships use collection software because they're collecting on buy here, pay here, for example. Go through your payables list, make a list of the vendors, and start by contacting some of the vendors. There are software packages that will let you use them as a hub so you can keep track of your vendors and who's signed the agreements that you have to get signed. There's 5 or 6 of them. So consider software when you're considering these things to keep your information in a central hub so you see what items are left being done that need to be done and what items you still need to be doing. You must have a signed agreement with any vendor that has PII and transmit PII that they will comply. This is part of the new regulations. And you must re-verify periodically, at least annually, that they will still comply. You have to document it however you want to document it. If you want to do it from a purely analog way, you can have a form called a report of discussion form where it says, I talked to Joe, I talked to him this time, here's the phone number, and here's the conversation we had. Heidi Thompson asked, when we contact vendors, what are we asking from them? Are they being prompted to create a form and explanation of their own internal handling? Is this a signed agreement or template is available? The templates are available through these software vendors. Yes, you have to ask them to make sure that they are encrypting their information, that they are both at rest and in transit. If I were a dealer now, I would also ask them for indemnification. As a business consultant, I want you to ask for somebody else to protect you at all times. And it is a signed agreement. You have to get somebody to sign that agreement. Jeffrey Running asked, do I have an agreement template that we can use? I don't, Jeffrey, but I'll see what I can do to try to get one for you. Dealers must oversee the service providers. It's your responsibility to monitor and assess what's going on with these vendors and to audit and document all the activity that you do with these vendors. So again, if the FTC comes in and wants to audit what you're doing, you can say, here's our binder, or here's our software program, here's how we're doing it. I get asked the question very often, do I think that the FTC is going to come in on December the 10th and start looking? I don't think that's the way it'll start. I obviously don't know that, but I think it will start with another problem. So as an example, if you're not handling your customer problems and you've got customers who are unhappy and complaining to the FTC, I think if the FTC gets enough complaints, they're going to come in and take a look at your operation. And while they're there, they're going to say, by the way, I want to see how you're complying with the Gramm Leach Bliley Act. Please show me all these things. I think that's how it started. Elizabeth Barrera said, NADA website has templates just for my information. Thank you, Elizabeth. I had read all their information, but I forgot, but I appreciate you updating me on that. And I will keep that in mind. So thanks so much for that. Data retention. So if you think about the amount of data that you have in all of your DMS and your CRM, consider, one of my colleagues said that this extra data is like toxic waste. The FTC now considers it as a liability. So you have to have a written data retention policy. And what that means is, I'm going to keep my service customers for X years, and here's why. You have to have a rationale on why you're going to keep them and why it's important to keep that data. And then you have to adhere to the data retention policy. So if you're only going to keep that data, like the customer hasn't been in 4 years, and after 4 years, you're going to run the routine to get rid of the data, you have to adhere to it and you have to document it. Retention of the data must be for a necessary business purpose. So if you, as long as you can write down what that necessary business purpose is and why, that's important. And under the data, there's a lot of rules that, excuse me, if you have under 5,000 customers that you don't have to follow, and we're going to touch on them just very quickly. But if you have 83 applications per month, in 5 years, you're going to reach 5,000. So I would, almost every dealership I've spoken to so far has, it can't use the exemption here. Is there any wiggle room in this for reasonability? What the FTC says is, quote, that are appropriate to your size and complexity and the sensitivity of any customer information. So it's different if you're a small store that might only have 30 people versus a large store that has 250 or 300. So is there some wiggle room in here? You'll have to talk to counsel about your opinion on the wiggle room, about how much you have to comply or don't have to comply. I'd say you have to comply, but some of the bigger issues that are appropriate to your size and complexity, I think you can consider those words and decide for yourself whether that allows you any leeway whatsoever. So you have to have a risk assessment in writing that has identified security risks. And we're talking about IT here. So what identified security risks? Do you have patch problems? Do you have software that helps you mitigate those issues? What criteria are you using to make sure that you have the right controls in place? And you have to have a description of how those risks will be mitigated. So if you, for example, if you have equipment that's 4 years old that will no longer update the security software to prevent cyber breaches, then how are you, what's your plan to get rid of those machines and upgrade the software? Some risk may be acceptable, but you have to write as a part of your risk assessment, you have to write why it's acceptable. And you have to have an information security program, which is part of all this. Also part of your IT requirements, you have to have multi-factor authentication, or MFA. Multi-factor authentication is where you have to verify that you are who you are so someone else can't get into your computer. That's usually done either through verifying through email or text message. The most popular way it's done is by text message. So as a part of the infrastructure that you need to have for your IT requirements, you have to have continuous monitoring of all of your information systems. That means you have to have somebody behind glass screens that are looking at all of your computers and all of your data flowing in and out, and they can tell you whether there's a problem or not. That's option one. Or option two, annual penetration testing and vulnerability assessments conducted every 6 months. So it's one or the other. Vendor risk assessments, so that access to your customer information is one thing you have to check. You have to make sure you're up to date on your antivirus software and document that. Endpoint protection is what you have to have, which is a fancy name to say that you're remotely monitoring, updating all of your computers. Endpoint protection is part of the continuous monitoring. It's also part of making sure your antivirus software is up to date. And then you have to consider virtual private networks. Are they secure? Nathan asked, is the computer that needs MFA, is it the computer that needs MFA DMS websites, or what exactly? So good question, Nathan. The FTC hasn't specified, to my knowledge, that it has to be every single app that you go into or your computer. For now, until there's further guidance on that, I would say it's okay as long as you MFA into your computer. I have not read anything or heard anything about this, but if I do, I'll let you know. But that, for the time being, as an example, there's a product that's called Duo, D-U-O, that enables you to MFA into your computer. And I think it's reasonable to conclude that if you MFA into your computer, then while the other softwares are coming up to speed on MFA, that would certainly suffice. Esmeralda Lorenzo Mendez said, can we come back to watch this meeting in case we miss anything? Yes, it'll be posted on NCM as well as on my YouTube channel under Better Vantage Point. Craig Missick said, you mentioned email. Most providers send to our CRM via email ADF XML format, which is processed and added as needed. This is no longer allowed. That's correct. The ADF XML is not encrypted. I'm not so sure JSON XML, but it has to be encrypted. If it's not encrypted, it's not going to work. Will a firewall be considered reasonable virus protection? Steve Steve P asked. I think you have to have more than just a firewall. I think each computer needs its own antivirus software, Steve. So information requirements for vulnerability testing. NADA recommended vulnerability testing monthly. That's not required. The FTC mandates it biannually. This is a risk versus cost issue that you'll have to think about. That's part of risk mitigation. A good patch management solution, which is making sure that each computer's software is up to date on their for antivirus. NADA says that that's fine. NADA also says a goal is to keep the system secure and patch with a scan to prove it. Whatever you're doing here, just make sure you document with those report of discussion forms, or if you choose to use one of those softwares, then document it. Michael Price asked, is TLS encryption enough for email? Michael, I don't know the answer to that. I'll be happy to find out if you email me that, but I'm not sure. Floyd Allen asked, so if the customer wants us to email them information, what is being recommended to use and send them information that they request? Well, if you're sending them information, Floyd, I don't know what would be PII on there. So if you'll follow up with that, I'll be glad to answer it. Biannual vulnerability assessments to detect publicly known vulnerabilities. I spoke to a colleague this week who said that she knows of a dealership that was hacked and held ransom because they didn't have a password encrypted in their service lane, as I understand it. So the Wi-Fi was open, and that's how they got hacked. NADA says that a potential safe harbor for this is to follow the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls. That's kind of a safe harbor is where if you follow those protocols, then if someone comes in, then you can say, look, we followed these protocols, and this is kind of the standard in the industry. That in of itself would probably be its own 2-hour webinar, so we're not going to get into that today. Annual penetration testing. Floyd Alex asked, is there a vendor that goes through all of this and checks boxes for us so you don't have to piece it together? There are software vendors, Alex, that take care of about 30% of this, but a lot of this is going to require good old-fashioned shoe leather and work. The software will keep track of what you're doing because you have to input it, but some of these, like these IT issues, you have to look at these IT issues and fix these problems outside of a software program. So all the software programs that I mentioned, they'll help you with the vendor management, they'll help you with the forms, they'll help you keep track of the information, but they're not going to go into your IT systems and tell you what to do. Some of them will and some of them won't help with the vulnerability tests and the phishing tests, and we're going to talk about that right now. So the annual penetration testing, is when white hat or good guy vendors attempt to circumvent or defeat your security features and attempt to penetrate your database or controls from both the inside and out. So that includes social engineering and phishing. Social engineering is an attack that relies on human interaction and involves manipulating people into breaking security procedures. So social engineering would be sending an email, phishing is sending an email, go to the definition, the fraudulent practice of sending emails purporting to be from reputable companies in order to induce individuals to reveal information. Social engineering might be manipulating people to break security procedures. So asking them to do something that would be outside of the physical location for financial gain, often what I hear on social engineering is somebody receives, the payables clerk said, receives an email that says, please go out and get me some Apple gift cards. I need $5,000 worth. That would be social engineering. Floyd says, when you send the initial agreement or pencil to purchase a vehicle, this is a follow-up to what he asked about emailing customer information to them. Yes, that would be transmitting PII through there. So you'll have to figure out a way to encrypt that. And Alex, I'm not sure, Alex, what you mean by, can you repeat the software? Okay, continuous monitoring and logging in real time. So this is if you choose continuous monitoring, you have to be able to detect unauthorized users, unauthorized access to customer information, and detect tampering with customer information. This is what continuous monitoring does. MFA we talked about briefly. The dealer must implement MFA for individuals accessing any information which contains PII. This includes for the dealership and any vendors who exchange PII. And we talked about the definition having changed. You need to have a qualified individual who will oversee all this information. Originally, the FTC said that you needed to have a CISO, or Chief Information Security Officer. They've since changed that, and a qualified individual who is responsible for overseeing, implementing, and enforcing your written information security program. As far as my consulting practice goes, I see a lot of dealers taking on this role. So that's one way to do it. But someone who has to understand the totality of what the program is and be able to implement it. Nathan Breeden said, so pen testing doesn't have to be them attempting to hack into our network, just social, and it has to be all the above, Nathan. Jason Welsh asked, what about voice over internet protocol systems using SIP? Do we need to make to ensure and have written proof of encryption? I don't know about SIP traffic. Feel free to reach out afterwards and we can talk about that. Required change management procedures. And Jason, I will write that down and ask about SIP on VoIP. Required change management procedures. It's important to have these change management procedures in place, because in case the person handling this, the qualified individual, if you will, in case that person goes on vacation and there's a problem, or in case they get fired, or in case they change jobs, or whatever it is, you have to have change management procedures in place. I recommend that there are written, so that, again, anyone who comes in to look will see that you have written protocols. And this is to make sure that your program will outlast that one particular individual. The goals of the change management program is controlling the life cycle of this program through standardization. That's you controlling your risk, making sure that you're on top of all of the items that we're talking about today. And if the person leaves, the qualified individual, this of course minimizes disruption. We talked briefly, Jason Gordon said Alex might be referring to Duo for MFA. I think I answered that question. If I didn't, please reach out again and I'll be happy to answer it. So if you have 5,000 or fewer customers, which we talked about, 83 applications per year exceeds 5,000 customers over 5 years. The items that are not necessary if you have 5,000 or fewer customer files is you don't have to have continuous monitoring, pen testing, vulnerability testing and scans, written risk assessments, written incident response plans, or written annual reports to the board. You are required, if you do have more than 5,000 people, to have a written annual report summarizing all of your activity, summarizing where your vulnerabilities are, summarizing what happens with your pen testing and your vulnerability testing, and making sure that you're reporting to the owners or the board of directors exactly where your program is, where you see the risks, where you consider risks coming from, and what you're going to do about them. So for most dealerships, You have to have continuous monitoring of systems, the vulnerability testing and scans semi-annually, the penetration test annually, a written incident response plan, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, a written risk assessment, and the written annual report to your board. We talked briefly about wiggle room. And importantly, you have to have annual training. So annual training is for all employees. It is mandatory. I suggest you document them with employee acknowledgement, so a signed employee acknowledgement. And this includes everybody at the dealership. Here's an example of a robust training program. Here's 12 sample topics: introduction to information security, private data, password security, computer security, antivirus, email security, portable devices, i.e. cell phones, iPads, those kinds of things, and security surrounding them, web browsing security, social engineering, wireless and remote security, workplace security, and then security incident response. So let's take a couple of minutes on your risk assessment. Your risk assessment must be in writing, must address possible areas of concern and areas of risk. Dealers must periodically perform these assessments, and it has to be updated as risks suggest. Your written incident response plan, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, this is your business-wide communication plan. So this isn't just for internally for what you would communicate to your employees if you had a data breach. This is how the dealership will respond in total, who has what responsibility and can make decisions. Who is it who's going to talk to the media? Who is it who's going to handle customer complaints? Who is going to handle the inbound phone traffic? Who's gonna talk to the media? All of those things. This is both communication inside the store as well as to third parties. Any conversation about the Gramm Leach Bliley Act would not be, I would not be doing my job if I didn't mention cyber insurance. We have a couple other questions. Craig asks, will confirmation emails and texts that would contain maybe a vehicle appointment date and time and services requested, would that be considered PII to the expecting customer? If you're giving them back their name, their address, their email or cell phone number, then Craig, the answer to that is yes. It has to be encrypted. Christy Warren says, can you scan and email your stack when the presentation is over? Happy to. At the end, send me an email with your information and I'll be glad to do that. So cyber insurance. Check if you don't have cyber insurance, number one, you should. Number two, check to see if you have a breach, whether the related expenses are covered. So sometimes cyber policies have what's called a sidecar or a sub limit that will help you with public relations expenses, helping you come in and do an audit about what happened. Most cyber policies will not cover you for FTC fines and issues, but there are other policies potentially that might cover you for that. Very quickly, just to use some round numbers, I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in Salt Lake City speaking to CPAs who do books for car dealers. And during that time, I asked them for what they felt a reasonable blue sky number was for a dealership. And the numbers came out in the $20 to $30 million range. Some said 50 million. Then we got into a conversation about how many customer records is your dealership holding? I came up with a very low and conservative number of 250,000. The reason I'm bringing this up is let's do some quick math. Let's assume you have to pay for credit monitoring for everybody who you've had in a data breach. And let's just say, because I checked recently, credit monitoring is $8, $9 a month, so $100 a year. If you do that quick math, 250,000 customers times $100 per year for monitoring is $25 million. So when you're considering cyber insurance, consider that if you have a breach of 250,000 names, $25 million potentially in just monitoring expenses only, if that's mandated. So be conservative when you're thinking about this. An anonymous person said, you haven't heard anyone cover if the safeguard rules applies to protecting physical files. We covered that a few minutes earlier. That's when I suggested the door closer on the F&I files, repair orders laying around in the service department. They all contain PII. Anything that has the customer's name, address, phone number, or email address laying around anywhere is a potential breach of the Gramm Leach Bliley safeguard regulations. So the overall philosophy here is to remediate and correct, document and report, evaluate and revise. We talked about this a little bit earlier. So fines. So are there fines? Yes, there are fines, and each fine $46,517 per fine. The FTC can take an expansive view of what a violation is, depending on the circumstance, and particularly if there are issues involving multiple customer records. So if you breach 10 customer records, is that $460,000? It's unknowable at the moment, but it is clear that the FTC can take a broader view of what a violation is. So fines are a big problem. Ransomware. We talked about ransomware. Last year, there was a dealership group in Northern Virginia that was ransomed for $7 million. So take a look at your cyber policy if you have one. And if you don't have one, call your insurance agent today, start working on that. But usually there is a sub-limit for ransomware. It's usually not the complete limit. So if you have $1 million policy, ransomware is not always $1 million. Sometimes it's $250,000. So check to see if there's a sub-limit on that. Consider whether there's a business interruption portion on your cyber policy, or if your business interruption insurance on your garage policy will cover a business shutdown because of ransomware. Bobby Maynard says, what is the best practice for repair orders? Bobby, if the service advisor isn't standing right there at his desk, then I would suggest somehow they be locked up, covered up, secured in some way, maybe sitting behind the desk. Maybe you put up a petition so that nobody can reach over like the old days when you have customers hanging out at the service advisor's desks. Maybe they come out from that area. Maybe that gets glassed off. Maybe you have a window. It's hard for me to answer that, not knowing the physical limitations of your facility, but those repair orders do have to be secured. Nathan asked, do we have to have penetration tests done prior to December 2023? Or is their date expected to have us done earlier than that? I don't have an exact answer on that, Nathan. It's a very good question. I would say that before 2023, if you have all these other items though locked down and that's the only item, I don't think that's a huge concern if everything else is handled. But I would certainly have it done well in advance of December 23, maybe early in 23. But I haven't seen or heard any specific guidance as to when. It just says that it has to be done. Marlo asked if we post customer names on our Facebook page or our screens in the showroom, would that violate the policy? Marlo, it's a great question. One of the things from a risk perspective that I would advocate is a short release form, a media release that says, I, Mrs. Customer, hereby am okay with you posting my name and my likeness and my picture on, ABC Chevrolet's Facebook page. I think that's probably okay if they've given you permission to do that. I would not post a customer's picture without getting them to make sure that they're clear that you're going to post their picture. the old adage in the car business is if you don't have it in writing, it really didn't happen. So your liability, my understanding from the lawyers, and again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a business consultant, there's no private right of action in the Gramm-Leach Bliley Act. And what that means is if you have a breach, somebody can't sue you under the Gramm-Leach Bliley Act. But that doesn't prevent a state lawsuit under the UDAP statutes, UDAP standing for unfair, deceptive, abusive acts or practices. And those statutes usually have what's called attorney fee shifting provisions. And what that means is that the person suing you will put the burden of their attorney's fees on the dealership. Most of these UDAP statutes have that. And then there are possible punitive damages. Each state is different. Using Virginia as an example, Virginia has a $350,000 cap. Not all states do, but there are possible punitive damages. Good data security equals good business. You don't want to call your third generation customer and tell him or her that their data is sitting out on the dark web. So not only is it important to comply with these FTC guidelines because you're supposed to comply with them, good data security is a good idea for business reasons. You don't want to have a damage to your reputation, calling your customers and telling them their data has been breached and is out on the dark web. An anonymous attendee said, just to clarify, if we're sending a text to a customer, are we allowed to put their name and type of vehicle we are inquiring about? I'm not sure why you'd put their name on it. I think the vehicle they're inquiring about is fine. I see no problem with that from my perspective. This is a lot of information. I get asked this a lot, seriously, and the answer is yes, seriously. There is a lot of information here to absorb. I am happy to answer your questions. We certainly have a few more minutes left. If you would like a copy of this presentation, please do send me an email. Here is my email address. Here is my phone number. I'm certainly glad to send you a copy of any of this information. And I will pause here and see if anyone has any questions that I can answer that I haven't answered already. Certainly want to answer all your questions to the extent that I can. Steve, we've got 4 or 5 questions coming in. Steve asked, when we pencil a deal, are we allowed to have the customer information on it when they're at the dealership? As long as that's not laying around and that other eyes can't see it, if you pencil the deal and then the salesman's taking the information and walking it right into them, I see no problem with that. If there's something else to that, Steve, please follow up with me. RC Hill said, thank you, Tom, for presenting. When I hear the words monitor and assess associated with very sophisticated tech companies with which we lowly car dealers interact, the words sound like we were to become independent auditors of these companies. Unfortunately, RC, it is your responsibility to do that. And I've talked to some of these software vendors, RC, and some of them are not prepared for this. Some of them don't know about it. And so the FTC has put the burden on us as dealers. It's time consuming and expensive to do it, but that is what the requirements are. Tony Mina said, sorry to ask again, but do we need MDR? I'm not sure what MDR is, so apologize, I don't know, but if you'll type that out, I'll be happy to try to answer it. Michael Price, so is greeting a customer a violation? So Michael Price said, is greeting a customer, hi Joe, is that a violation? Not yet. Tony Mina said, thank you, Tom. David Teft said, great YouTube channel, thank you. Bobby Maynard, would it be a good practice to provide salespeople with iPads with MFAs? Would it be a good practice to provide salespeople with iPads with MFAs on them, as opposed to having them work through the apps on their cell phones? If the apps on the cell phones don't have MFA, then the answer to that is yes, because there's going to be customer information that's going back and forth. or you can have computers at their desks with MFA, Bobby. If there's any follow-up, please ask me. I'm happy to answer it. Cheryl Hollyfield asked, credit applications submitted on the website this will no longer be allowed. It will be allowed if it's encrypted. If it's not encrypted, then it's a problem, Cheryl. Nathan Breeden, manage detection and response, so a company keeps track of potential attacks. So I'm not sure I remember what your question was. Manage detection and response is part, I assume what you're saying is that's continuous monitoring. So if you have continuous monitoring, you don't have to do the vulnerability testing or the pen testing. Mike Million said, if we put systems in place for continuous monitoring and those systems send out alerts to our IT team and they react immediately, do we need to do pen testing and vulnerability testing? Not according to the FTC. If you have continuous monitoring, then the pen testing, the vulnerability testing are not necessary. Management detection and response. Thank you, Tony. Actual real-time monitoring of the computer. So I think I've answered that. David said, I see the MCM logo. I assume you do 20 group meetings. I have. If so, I'd like to recommend you for our next meeting. Thank you for the time and presentation. Great stuff. Thanks, David. Appreciate the shout out there. Feel free to reach out to me. Elizabeth Barrera said MDR is required. Joshua Patrick said, will salespeople need two-factor authentication on CRM apps on their phones? The answer to that is yes, or they can't access that information being in compliance with the Gramm Leach Bliley. Eric Hinkle, solid presentation, Tom. Thank you. Thanks, Eric, for the shout out. Joshua Patrick, thank you. Thank you, Joshua. Callie Gifford said, what about customers sending you their information through Facebook private messages? Is that allowed, or how to protect? According to the regulations, Callie, that would not be allowed because they're sending you their PII and you're not protecting it. How to protect that is to find a data encryption method for you to do that, rerouting that information in some way. Let's see. Sarah Penland said, thank you, great information update. Thank you, Sarah. Let's see, Tom Dwyer, have you heard anything on the FTC pushing back the deadline? No, Tom, I have not. I would be surprised if they did, only because they gave us a year. We started hearing about this in October of last year. So I would be surprised if they push back the deadline, and I have not heard anything yet. Tony said, okay, where could I confirm MDR or penetration to vulnerability testing information? Certainly the FTC website, Tony, if you want to get that in writing. The NADA also put out a book under the FTC safeguards rules. So if you're a member of NADA, you could also get the information there. Callie asked another question. What about the customer sending you their information through, no, we just answered that one. Let's see. Do I have a short list of recommended vendors to help get compliant, or is NCM only recommending me? I do have a list of vendors. If you reach out to me, I'll be happy to do that, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous attendee. I do advocate that the dealerships used software. I think it helps. You'll have to determine whether the value is there for what these vendors are charging. I do not have a software company. I'm a consultant trying to help dealers with these problems and trying to help them solve some of these problems that you all are bringing up. Tony said, thank you, FTC, best. And let's see, what are any other questions or comments that you have at this point? I'll hang out for a few more minutes. So far, we have 52 questions answered. 56 questions. And I'll hang on for just a couple more minutes. Again, my phone number and my email address are on the screen. If you'd like a copy of the presentation, feel free to reach out. And Michelle Wagner said, great, thank you, great information. Laura Lemko said, thank you, great information. Elizabeth Barrera said, thank you. Tony Mina said, great job, Tom, thanks again. Thank you for all the positive feedback. Kevin Galligan said, thanks for your information. Apologies if I'm butchering anybody's name. It is 1:25 Eastern. And with that, if there's nothing else, Donovan Tokar said, thank you for the presentation. I also emailed you to get a copy. Mike Millian, do I have any specific information on door key control requirements? No, Mike, I mean, the door key control, some of my dealers are using thumbprints, some are using keys, some are using keypads. Any of that is fine as long as somebody can't walk into either your office where all your files are, your F&I office, your sales manager's office, and pick up a group of files and walk out with that PII. The important part is that it's locked. AVH Maryland, what about if service ROs are on the back counter? Should they be secure at closing? Yes, they should. There should not, nobody should be able to, to get to those information. Lawrence McNamara, as always, great job, Tom, and thanks for all the tasks you gave me. Laugh out loud. You're welcome, Larry. Call me, I'll give you some more tasks to complete. Ron Garrison said, I emailed you for a copy. Lots of information. Repair order, Elizabeth Barrera said repair orders in the tech stalls. I think, Elizabeth, in most instances, that's okay because people can't just wander in to get that information. So if you have customers who can wander into the tech stalls, I think that's a different liability question. But I think the repair orders on the tech stalls, that's not out open in the public where service advisor desks are. It's easy to reach over and grab the repair orders and walk out with them, or, you know, look over there and grab some of them, anything like that. So from most dealerships that I've ever been in my life, I think repair orders in the tech stalls are okay as long as that area is secure. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, with that, we'll end. I'm Tom Klein, and thanks for seeing things from a better vantage point. Please let me know if I can help you in any other way. Take care.